Story Lord is not really a villain because he does not want destruction, domination, or chaos. What he wants is order, not the practical kind that keeps systems running, but the narrative kind that makes life feel justified. He arrives in Rick and Morty not as a threat to existence, but as a promise to explain it. He offers meaning where there is randomness, arcs where there is drift, and purpose where there is exhaustion. This is what makes him feel disarming rather than dangerous at first. Villains usually announce themselves through force. Story Lord announces himself through familiarity. He speaks in patterns everyone recognizes: growth, redemption, destiny, lessons learned. These are not weapons in the traditional sense, they are comforts. They reassure you that what you are experiencing fits into a larger shape, that suffering is temporary and productive, that everything leads somewhere intentional. Story Lord does not create stories, he enforces them. He takes the raw, uneven material of life and presses it into shapes that feel satisfying. This is not inherently malicious. In fact, it is something people do constantly to survive. Humans tell themselves stories to make sense of loss, failure, and uncertainty. Story Lord simply externalizes that impulse and gives it form. What makes him unsettling is not cruelty, but certainty. He knows how things should go. He knows when a character has suffered enough, when growth is due, when a sacrifice should pay off. His confidence is soothing. It removes ambiguity. It replaces the anxiety of not knowing with the relief of structure. In this way, Story Lord represents something deeply human: the desire for experiences to matter in a way that feels fair. He offers a universe where nothing is wasted, where pain is always in service of development, where randomness is an illusion that resolves into meaning by the end. For many people, that is not a nightmare. It is a wish. This is why Story Lord is not really a villain. He does not deceive people into caring. He meets them where they already are. He amplifies a longing that exists long before he appears. The longing for narrative closure, for explanation, for reassurance that chaos is not pointless. Rick's resistance to Story Lord is often misread as cynicism or arrogance, but it is rooted in a different kind of honesty. Rick understands that stories can become cages, that once you accept the premise that everything must mean something, you lose the freedom to let things simply happen. Growth becomes mandatory. Suffering becomes instrumental. Choice becomes constrained by expectation. Story Lord's power lies in how easily people surrender to him, not because they are weak, but because structure is comforting. Stories promise rest. They say you can stop wondering what this all is for because the answer has already been written. All you need to do is follow the arc. That is not villainy in the classic sense. It is overprotection. It is meaning applied too forcefully. Story Lord does not ask whether you want an arc. He assumes you do. He assumes that uncertainty is intolerable and that resolution is always preferable. This assumption is where the harm begins, quietly. When every moment must contribute to a lesson, moments lose their autonomy. When every failure must lead to growth, failure stops being allowed to exist on its own terms. Story Lord's universe does not permit stagnation, ambiguity, or unresolved grief. Everything must move forward in a narratively acceptable way. For some characters, this feels like salvation. For others, it feels suffocating. Rick rejects Storylord not because he hates meaning, but because he knows how easily meaning becomes coercive. Stories decide who deserves redemption, who must suffer longer, who is allowed to change, and who must remain static to support someone else's arc. Under narrative logic, freedom narrows without announcing itself. Storylord is not evil. He is convinced that order is kinder than chaos. That explanation is gentler than uncertainty. That arcs are better than drift. And for many people, he is right, at least temporarily. But life does not always resolve. Some pain does not teach. Some moments do not lead anywhere. Some people do not grow in ways that feel satisfying or narratively clean. Storylord cannot tolerate that. His world has no room for meaninglessness. And meaninglessness is sometimes the most honest state there is. This is why Storylord feels dangerous without feeling cruel. He removes the option to opt out of significance. He insists that everything must add up. And when everything adds up, nothing is allowed to simply be. Villains usually take something away. Storylord gives something and asks for too much in return. He gives structure, reassurance, and closure. In exchange, he takes uncertainty, freedom, and the right to remain unfinished. That trade is tempting. It feels safe. It feels kind. And that is why Storylord is not really a villain. He is a reflection of a desire most people carry quietly. The desire for their lives to make sense in a way that feels earned. The danger is not in wanting that. The danger is in never being allowed to want anything else. Storylord's danger becomes clearer when his presence is allowed to settle rather than escalate. At first, his influence feels stabilizing. The world sharpens. Conflicts align. Motivations clarify. Characters are no longer drifting, they are progressing. There is relief in this alignment, a sense that uncertainty has finally been addressed rather than endured. But alignment comes with cost. Once a story takes hold, deviation becomes error. Actions are no longer judged by intention or necessity, but by whether they serve the arc. Moments that do not contribute to growth are trimmed away. Emotions that do not advance the plot are reframed or dismissed. Life becomes efficient, purposeful, and increasingly narrow. This is where Storylord differs from a traditional antagonist. He does not impose suffering arbitrarily. He assigns it. Pain becomes meaningful by design. Loss becomes justified by outcome. Nothing is allowed to be gratuitous. On the surface, this feels compassionate. It reassures people that what they endure will not be wasted. Yet this reassurance quietly removes consent. Characters do not get to decide whether their suffering should become a lesson. They are enrolled automatically. Growth is no longer something that happens organically. It is demanded. Resistance is framed as denial. Stagnation becomes failure. Storylord's world is one where nothing is permitted to simply stop. Everything must transform. Everything must resolve. This creates constant forward pressure, a sense that rest is only allowed once development has been achieved. But development never truly ends. There is always another arc, another lesson, another necessary challenge waiting. In this sense, Storylord is not a villain of destruction, but of exhaustion. His universe never allows people to simply exist without justification. Every emotion must lead somewhere. Every relationship must teach something. Every mistake must be redeemed. The weight of that expectation becomes heavy over time. Rick's resistance is often interpreted as rejection of meaning altogether. But that interpretation misses something subtle. Rick does not deny that meaning can exist. He denies that it should be mandatory. He understands that forcing meaning onto every moment turns life into obligation. When everything must matter, nothing can rest. Story Lord cannot tolerate rest. Rest is narratively unproductive. It pauses momentum. It creates space where nothing happens, and nothing happening is unacceptable to a system built on constant progression. In his presence, even silence is reinterpreted as setup. Even stillness becomes foreshadowing. This is where Story Lord begins to feel less like a guide and more like a constraint. He decides when someone has suffered enough, when redemption is earned, when closure is due. These decisions are framed as benevolent, but they are absolute. There is no appeal. The story knows best. Villains typically impose their will through force. Story Lord imposes his through inevitability. Once the story is in motion, resisting it feels futile. You are no longer choosing your path. You are fulfilling it. The distinction is subtle, but profound. This is why Story Lord resonates so strongly as a concept. He embodies the pressure people feel to make sense of their lives in ways that feel acceptable, productive, and complete. He represents the internal voice that says suffering must pay off, that wandering is wasteful, that unfinished things are failures. That voice is not malicious. It is protective. It wants reassurance. It wants to believe that everything happens for a reason. Story Lord gives form to that belief and reveals what happens when it goes unchallenged. A life governed entirely by narrative logic becomes predictable. Safe, perhaps, but narrow. Surprises are filtered out. Ambiguity is resolved too quickly. Complexity is flattened into themes. People stop being people and become roles. Roles are easier to manage than contradictions. Story Lord's presence exposes how seductive this simplification can be. It feels good to know who you are supposed to be. It feels comforting to believe that your pain is necessary. It feels stabilizing to trust that everything is building towards something worthwhile. But life does not always cooperate with that structure. Some losses do not transform into wisdom. Some mistakes do not redeem themselves. Some people change in ways that do not fit an arc at all. Storylord's system cannot accommodate these realities, so it reshapes them until they fit. That reshaping is the true danger. Not because it lies, but because it over-explains. It removes the option for experiences to remain unresolved, ambiguous, or simply unfinished. It denies the legitimacy of moments that exist without payoff. Story Lord is not really a villain because he does not seek to harm. He seeks to help too much. He believes that explanation is always better than uncertainty, that structure is always kinder than openness. He cannot imagine that freedom might include the right to drift, to fail without lesson, to exist without justification. Rick understands this intuitively. His rejection of Story Lord is not a rejection of stories, but of being trapped inside one. He resists not because he hates arcs, but because he knows how easily arcs become expectations, and expectations become chains. Story Lord offers a world where everything makes sense. Rick prefers a world where things are allowed not to. The conflict between them is not good versus evil. It is certainty versus freedom, comfort versus honesty, closure versus openness story. Lord promises peace through meaning. Rick accepts chaos to preserve choice. This is why Story Lord is unsettling rather than monstrous. He does not threaten annihilation. He threatens completion. And completion, when imposed too early or too forcefully, can be just as suffocating as destruction. In the end, Story Lord is not really a villain because he represents something understandable and familiar, the desire for life to feel coherent, the hope that suffering leads somewhere, the comfort of believing that nothing is random. What makes him dangerous is not that he lies, but that he refuses to stop explaining. And sometimes, the most humane thing a story can do is allow space where no explanation arrives. What makes Story Lord linger in the mind is not his defeat, but how easily he could return. He does not rely on power or technology that can be destroyed. He relies on something far more resilient, the human tendency to frame experience as narrative. Even when he is gone, the impulse he represents remains active, quietly organizing events into beginnings, middles, and ends without being asked to do so. This is why Story Lord does not need to win to be effective. His logic persists even in resistance to him. Characters still look for lessons. Audiences still anticipate arcs. Pain is still weighed against potential payoff. The story continues to exert pressure long after the character enforcing it has disappeared. Story Lord's influence is ambient rather than centralized. This ambient quality is what separates him from conventional antagonists. He does not dominate through presence. He dominates through expectation. Once people believe that everything must add up, they begin policing themselves. They interpret their own lives through narrative rules, judging moments by whether they contribute to growth or resolution. Story Lord no longer needs to intervene. The structure sustains itself. In this sense, Story Lord functions less like a villain and more like an ideology. An ideology does not threaten you directly. It persuades you that its framework is natural, even necessary. It convinces you that alternatives are irresponsible or immature. Story Lord's ideology says that randomness is intolerable, that drift is wasteful, and that unresolved stories are failures. That ideology is comforting, especially in a universe as chaotic as the one Rick inhabits. Chaos is exhausting. Uncertainty erodes confidence. The promise that everything is heading somewhere specific can feel like relief. Story Lord offers that relief generously. He does not ask for belief, he assumes it. Rick's discomfort with Story Lord is rooted in the recognition that relief can become dependency. Once you rely on narrative structure to justify experience, you lose the ability to endure moments that do not resolve. You become impatient with ambiguity. You start demanding closure, not because it is earned, but because it feels necessary. This impatience reshapes behavior. People rush grief. They hurry transformation. They force meaning onto experiences that are not ready to carry it. Story Lord's world is efficient, but brittle. It cannot tolerate delay. It cannot sit with silence. Everything must move forward, or else it is considered broken. Rick understands that some things break without teaching anything. Some pain remains pain. Some loss does not transform. Storylord cannot allow that reality to exist. He must either redeem it or rewrite it. In doing so, he denies the legitimacy of suffering that does not become useful. This denial is subtle, and it often wears the mask of kindness. Story. Lord does not say that suffering is good. He says it is necessary. That distinction matters. When suffering becomes necessary, refusing it becomes irresponsible. Endurance becomes obligation. Choice disappears behind justification. Rick's rejection of Storylord is often framed as rejection of growth, but it is more accurately a rejection of forced growth. Rick resists the idea that everyone must change in narratively satisfying ways. He knows that transformation imposed from the outside is not growth at all. It is compliance. Storylord's insistence on arcs also reshapes identity. Characters become defined by where they are in the story, rather than who they are in the moment. You are not allowed to simply be confused, tired, or stuck. You must be in the middle of your arc. Even stagnation becomes temporary by decree. This can feel motivating at first. It gives direction. It provides reassurance. But over time, it becomes alienating. You stop trusting your own pace. You feel behind if change is slow. You feel guilty if nothing seems to be happening. Storylord. Lord's presence accelerates life until stillness feels like failure. This is where Rick's cynicism becomes protective rather than dismissive. By refusing Storylord's framework, Rick preserves the right to remain unresolved. He allows for lives that do not progress neatly, for moments that do not teach, for stories that simply stop without delivering closure. That allowance is not comforting, but it is honest. It reflects a world where meaning emerges unevenly, if at all, where some experiences remain fragments rather than lessons, where people do not always become better versions of themselves. Storylord cannot tolerate fragments. He smooths them into wholes. He fills gaps with explanation. He resolves tension whether it wants to be resolved or not. This makes his world legible, but also artificial. Reality loses its rough edges. The unsettling truth is that many people prefer that artificiality. It feels safer. It feels kinder. It feels like progress. Storylord is not really a villain because he offers something people actively want. He does not impose order against resistance. He amplifies an existing desire for coherence. That desire is not wrong. It is human. Stories help people survive. They organize memory. They give pain context. They create shared understanding. Storylord becomes dangerous only when story stops being a tool and starts becoming law. Rick understands the difference instinctively. He does not reject stories entirely. He rejects being trapped inside one that will not let him stop, fail, or remain unchanged. He prefers chaos because chaos still allows refusal. This is why the conflict with Storylord feels so quiet compared to other threats. There is no final victory, no decisive moral. The tension remains unresolved because it mirrors a tension that never fully resolves in real life. The desire for meaning does not disappear just because it can be dangerous. Storylord is not really a villain because he does not represent an external enemy. He represents an internal pressure, the pressure to make sense, to justify pain, to finish arcs, to believe that everything happens for a reason. Rick pushes back, not because that pressure is false, but because it is incomplete. Meaning can exist without being compulsory. Stories can help without controlling. Closure can be valuable without being mandatory. Storylord cannot accept that balance. He wants certainty. He wants completion. He wants everything to add up. And that is why he remains unsettling long after he is gone. Not because he threatens the world, but because he reflects a temptation that never fully disappears. The temptation to trade freedom for explanation and uncertainty for comfort. He is not really a villain. He is a warning about what happens when meaning stops being optional. When Storylord is viewed this way, his presence stops feeling like an interruption and starts feeling like a mirror. He reflects back a habit so ingrained that it usually goes unnoticed. The habit of organizing experience so tightly that nothing is allowed to remain uncertain. He does not invent that habit. He simply removes the option to ignore it. This is why Storylord does not need to threaten anyone into compliance. The structure he offers is already familiar. People step into it willingly because it resembles how they already think when faced with chaos. When something hurts, they ask what it is for. When something ends, they ask what it taught them. When nothing seems to be happening, they worry that they are falling behind in their own story. Lord gives those questions answers immediately. Clean answers, reassuring answers. Answers that close the loop before discomfort has time to settle. In doing so, he eliminates a particular kind of pain, the pain of not knowing. But he replaces it with a quieter pressure, one that builds slowly and is harder to name. That pressure is the pressure to perform meaning. Once narrative becomes the organizing principle, experience is no longer enough on its own. It must justify itself. Feelings must be productive. Time must advance something. Even rest must be framed as preparation. Nothing is allowed to simply exist without explanation. At first, this feels motivating. Direction feels like relief. Structure feels like care. But over time, the space to simply be begins to shrink. People start evaluating themselves not by how they feel, but by where they are in the arc. Am I growing fast enough? Is this suffering paying off? Is this moment moving me forward? Story. Lord's world does not allow you to answer, "I don't know," and stop there. Rick's resistance becomes clearer here. He is not defending chaos for its own sake. He is defending the right to not turn every moment into a justification. He knows that some experiences lose their honesty when forced into meaning too quickly. Some wounds need to exist without being redeemed. Some moments are real precisely because they do not lead anywhere. Storylord cannot accept that. His logic requires that everything connect. Loose ends are intolerable. Ambiguity is inefficient. Silence must be filled. In his presence, even emptiness becomes a setup for future payoff. This is why Storylord's influence feels so total when it takes hold. It does not control actions directly. It controls interpretation. Once interpretation is controlled, behavior follows naturally. people begin steering themselves toward outcomes that feel narratively correct, even if those outcomes do not align with what they actually want or need. The danger is not that Storylord lies, it is that he overcommits. He commits meaning where it has not yet formed. He commits closure where there is still motion. He commits identity where there is still uncertainty. In doing so, he removes the permission to drift. Drift is often portrayed as failure, but drift can be honest. It reflects moments when direction is unclear, when growth is uneven, when life does not cooperate with structure. Storylord's world has no patience for drift. It must be reframed as a phase, a trial, a prelude. Drift is only tolerated if it leads somewhere. Rick understands that drift is sometimes the truest state. Not every pause is a setup. Not every confusion resolves. Some lives move sideways. Some people circle rather than progress. Some stories do not climax, they simply stop. Storylord's refusal to accept that is what makes him dangerous without making him cruel. He does not want to hurt anyone. He wants to organize them. He wants to help them make sense of themselves. He wants to remove the anxiety of not knowing. But anxiety is not always an error. Sometimes it is a signal that something cannot be resolved yet. Sometimes it is the cost of staying open. Rick chooses openness even when it hurts, not because he enjoys chaos, but because he recognizes the cost of closing things too early. A closed story feels finished, but it also feels dead. Life for Rick remains tolerable only if it stays unfinished. This is why Storylord and Rick cannot coexist comfortably. They represent incompatible tolerances. Storylord cannot tolerate uncertainty. Rick cannot tolerate enforced certainty. One wants everything to add up. The other insists that some things never will. Neither position is purely right or wrong. Stories do help people survive. Meaning does help people endure. But when meaning becomes mandatory, it stops being supportive and starts being prescriptive. It stops serving people and starts shaping them. Storylord's presence makes that shift visible. He shows what happens when the need for explanation overtakes the need for freedom. When comfort becomes control, when closure becomes obligation. He is not a villain who wants to end the world. He is a force that wants to finish it. Rick resists because he would rather live in a world that remains open, even if that openness is painful. He would rather accept randomness than surrender choice. He would rather allow stories to emerge naturally than be trapped inside one that refuses to let him stop. That resistance does not make Rick noble. It makes him honest about the cost of meaning. Storylord hides that cost behind reassurance. Rick exposes it by refusing the trade. This is why Storylord is unsettling long after his defeat. Not because he might return as a character, but because his logic returns constantly, in small ways. Every time someone demands that pain pay off, every time uncertainty is rushed into explanation, every time rest is reframed as laziness because it does not advance an arc. Storylord lives in those moments. He is not really a villain because he does not stand outside the story threatening it. He stands inside it, offering to take responsibility for meaning, so no one else has to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. And the quiet question he leaves behind is not whether stories are good or bad. but whether we can allow them to remain optional, whether we can let some moments stay unresolved, whether we can live without demanding that everything add up. Rick says yes, Storylord cannot. And that difference, small and philosophical, is where the real conflict lives. If there is a final, quiet truth about Storylord, it is that he never actually leaves. Not because he survives as a character, but because the conditions that allow him to exist are always present. As long as people feel discomfort in uncertainty, as long as randomness feels threatening rather than neutral, there will be a pull towards structure that promises relief. Story. Lord is simply the clearest expression of that pull. This is why his influence feels so subtle after the conflict passes. Nothing collapses. Nothing explodes. Life simply resumes. And yet the temptation remains. The temptation to frame pain as necessary, to treat confusion as a flaw, to assume that stillness must be justified by future progress. Story. Lord's voice becomes quieter, but it does not disappear. It blends into habit. Rick's resistance, then, is not a victory so much as a posture he must continually maintain. He does not defeat Story Lord once and for all. He refuses him again and again in small, uncelebrated ways. By not explaining, by not resolving, by letting moments remain awkward, unfinished, or meaningless. This refusal does not feel heroic. It feels uncomfortable. That discomfort is the point. What Storylord offers is comfort without patience. He skips the part where uncertainty is allowed to breathe. He rushes to reassurance. Rick understands that reassurance that arrives too early can hollow out experience rather than heal it. Some things need time. Some things never settle. Some things do not transform into wisdom or closure. They simply remain part of the landscape. Story. Lord cannot allow landscape. He needs trajectory. Trajectory gives direction, but it also narrows possibility. Once a direction is set, other paths fade. Rick prefers a world where paths remain open, even if that openness is disorienting. He accepts the anxiety of not knowing because it preserves choice. Storylord removes that anxiety by removing alternatives. This is why Storylord feels gentle rather than violent. He does not force people forward. He convinces them that forward is the only reasonable direction. He frames anything else as avoidance, denial, or failure. The coercion is internalized. People move themselves. Rick sees this clearly because he has lived inside systems that claimed to know what was best. He has seen how certainty can masquerade as care. Storylord's kindness is real, but incomplete. It helps by simplifying, and simplification always excludes something. In this case, it excludes the right to remain unresolved. The unresolved is where Rick chooses to live, not because it is pleasant, but because it is honest. He accepts that some lives do not resolve into clean arcs. Some people do not become better versions of themselves. Some pain does not redeem itself. For Rick, forcing meaning onto those realities feels more dishonest than accepting their randomness. Storylord represents the opposite instinct. He cannot bear to let anything remain without explanation. He needs every thread tied off, every emotion justified, every experience placed in context. He offers peace through completion. Rick understands that completion is not always peace. Sometimes it is erasure. This is the quiet ethical tension at the center of Story Lord's presence. Not whether meaning is good, but whether it should be compulsory. Not whether stories help, but whether they should govern. Story, Lord answers yes, Rick answers no. Neither answer is easy. A world without story can feel cold and indifferent. A world ruled by story can feel suffocating and false. Rick chooses the former because it preserves freedom. Story Lord chooses the latter because it promises comfort. That promise will always be tempting. Which is why Story Lord is not really a villain. Villains are defeated and removed. He is something that must be recognized and resisted, not destroyed. He represents a tendency rather than a threat, a desire rather than an enemy. He asks a simple question. Wouldn't it be easier if everything made sense? Rick answers with another question. At what cost? And in that exchange, quiet and unresolved, the story is allowed to remain open. What remains after that question is not clarity, but space. Space where answers are not immediately supplied. Space where discomfort is allowed to exist without being rushed into purpose. This space is what Story Lord cannot tolerate, and what Rick quietly protects. Living in that space does not feel heroic. It does not feel wise. Most of the time, it feels incomplete. That incompleteness is precisely why it matters. It keeps experience porous. It allows reality to arrive without being filtered into lessons or themes. It lets moments be uneven, unsatisfying, or quietly ordinary without demanding justification. Story Lord's worldview treats those moments as problems to be solved. Rick treats them as conditions to endure. Endurance is often misunderstood as passivity, but in this context, it is an active refusal. A refusal to over-explain. A refusal to polish pain into narrative value. A refusal to turn every experience into evidence of progress. Rick does not celebrate this refusal. He simply practices it. This practice shapes how time feels. Under Story, Lord's logic, time is always moving towards something. Each moment is evaluated based on where it fits in the arc. Under Rick's logic, time simply passes. Sometimes it accumulates meaning. Sometimes it does not. Both outcomes are acceptable. This acceptance is what gives Rick's resistance its quiet strength. He does not replace Story Lord's structure with another structure. He does not offer a counter-narrative. He leaves a gap. A gap where nothing is explained for you, where you must decide how much meaning to apply, if any. That gap can feel frightening. It can feel like abandonment. Story Lord fills it quickly because people often ask him to. Rick leaves it open because he knows that filling it too fast can erase something essential. The right to respond in your own time. The right to feel without immediately understanding why. In many ways, Story Lord represents the pressure to make sense of life faster than life itself moves. Rick resists that pressure, not because he dislikes sense, but because he knows how easily it becomes control. When explanations arrive before experiences have settled, they shape memory prematurely. They tell you what something was before you have finished feeling it. Story Lord's explanations are neat. Rick's reality is not. This difference is why Story Lord feels appealing and unsettling at the same time. He offers relief from uncertainty, but only by removing the freedom to remain uncertain. He offers clarity, but only by narrowing interpretation. He offers peace, but only by deciding what peace should look like. Rick chooses to live without that decision being made for him, even when it means carrying unresolved weight. He does not resolve every feeling. He does not redeem every loss. He does not finish every story. This does not make him free of suffering. It makes his suffering unprocessed and therefore honest. Storylord would call that wasteful. Rick would call it real. This is why Storylord is not really a villain in the traditional sense. He does not oppose life. He organizes it. He does not destroy freedom overtly. He replaces it gently with structure that feels reasonable. He does not lie. He simplifies. And simplification, when applied to something as complex and uneven as lived experience, always removes more than it admits. Rick's refusal is not a solution. It is a stance. One that must be maintained moment by moment without reassurance. He does not get the comfort of knowing that everything will add up. He accepts that it might not. Storylord promises an ending. Rick accepts the middle. And in that acceptance, there is no triumph, no lesson, no satisfying resolution. There is only continuation. Life moves on without explaining itself. Some things hurt without purpose. Some things end without meaning. Some moments remain fragments. That fragmentation is not failure. It is freedom. This is why Storylord cannot be fully defeated. His logic will always return when uncertainty feels unbearable. And this is why Rick's resistance is never complete. It must be renewed quietly, without applause, each time the temptation to explain away discomfort appears. Storylord asks for surrender to structure. Rick answers with tolerance for ambiguity. Neither answer is easy. One offers comfort, the other offers space. And the story, fittingly, does not resolve which one is right. It simply leaves the choice open, unfinished, and unresolved. Exactly where Rick insists it should be. What follows that openness is not clarity, but patience. Patience with moments that do not announce their significance. Patience with feelings that refuse to resolve. Patience with a life that does not organize itself into something tidy. This patience is uncomfortable, and that discomfort is exactly what Storylord tries to eliminate. Storylord cannot tolerate waiting. Waiting implies that meaning has not yet arrived, or may never arrive at all. He intervenes at the point where uncertainty lingers too long. He reframes delay as setup, confusion as foreshadowing, pain as necessary groundwork. In doing so, he removes the need to sit with not knowing. Rick understands that sitting with not knowing is part of being alive. Not a phase to rush through, but a state that returns again and again. He does not romanticize it. He does not claim it builds character. He simply accepts that some stretches of existence do not resolve into anything else. That acceptance is what makes Rick's position so unsatisfying and so honest. There is no reward for enduring ambiguity. There is no payoff for refusing to force meaning. The only thing you gain is the freedom to respond authentically rather than correctly. Story. Lord offers correctness. He knows what a moment should mean, how a character should change, when growth should occur. He removes doubt by replacing it with narrative inevitability. For many people, this feels like guidance. It feels like being taken care of. But guidance becomes control when it cannot be refused. Story. Lord's kindness is conditional. It depends on participation. You must play your role. You must learn your lesson. You must move when the story demands it. If you do not, you are framed as resistant, broken, or in denial. There is no neutral ground. Rick insists on neutral ground. He insists on the right to remain where he is without explanation, to experience pain without transforming it, to exist without advancing. This insistence does not make him admirable. It makes him stubborn. But it also makes him free in a way Story Lord cannot allow. The conflict between them is quiet because it is philosophical rather than physical. No worlds are destroyed in the argument itself. No weapons are drawn. What is at stake is interpretation. Who gets to decide what an experience means? Who gets to declare when something is finished? Story Lord wants to decide for everyone. Rick refuses that authority, not because he wants chaos to reign, but because he knows that meaning imposed from the outside erases the interior life it claims to explain. When someone else tells you what your pain is for, your relationship to that pain changes. It becomes obligation rather than experience. This is why Story Lord's presence feels subtly dehumanizing. Not because he removes emotion, but because he repurposes it. Feelings become fuel for narrative progression. They are no longer allowed to exist simply as responses. They must serve the arc. Rick's rejection preserves something fragile, the idea that feelings do not need to justify themselves. That confusion is allowed, that grief can remain grief, that not everything must be redeemed. This preservation does not make Rick kinder or gentler. It makes him more tolerant of discomfort. He carries unresolved things rather than converting them into lessons. That weight accumulates and it shows, but it is his weight. No one has rewritten it for him. Story. Lord cannot accept that kind of ownership. Ownership without resolution feels inefficient. He prefers to smooth experience into something legible and complete. He believes that is kindness. And in many cases, it is. Stories do help people survive. They give shape to chaos. They provide language for pain. The danger arises when that shape becomes mandatory. When every life must resemble a story, lives that do not fit are treated as errors. People who do not change are seen as stagnant. People who do not heal are seen as failures. Story Lord's world has little patience for those outcomes. It must either fix them or reframe them until they make sense. Rick chooses to live among outcomes that do not make sense. He does not elevate that choice. He does not defend it eloquently. He simply refuses to leave that space. He understands that forcing coherence too early can do more harm than letting incoherence remain. This is why Story Lord feels so familiar. He is the voice that says, surely this means something. Surely this will lead somewhere. Surely this pain is not pointless. That voice is comforting, especially when pain feels unbearable. Rick answers that voice with silence. Not because he enjoys silence, but because silence leaves room for truth to emerge on its own terms. Or not at all. Both are acceptable to him. In the end, Story Lord is not really a villain because he does not represent malice. He represents impatience with uncertainty. He represents the urge to close loops before they are ready. He represents the belief that meaning must always be found, even if it has to be imposed. Rick's resistance does not defeat that urge. It coexists with it. The tension remains unresolved, as it must. Stories will always tempt, meaning will always beckon. The desire for closure will never disappear. What Rick protects is the option to say no. No to forced growth. No to premature explanation. No to lives being reduced to arcs. That option is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not feel triumphant, but it is there, and as long as it remains, the story stays open. And with that openness preserved, something subtle becomes possible again. Choice without framing. Not the dramatic kind that leads to turning points or revelations, but the quieter kind that exists moment to moment. The choice to respond without knowing where it leads. The choice to feel without needing to explain why. The choice to stop without calling it a setback. Stora. Lord's absence does not create peace. It creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is not comfortable. It leaves gaps where reassurance used to be. It asks patience where answers once arrived automatically. This is why Storylord's logic is so tempting to return to. It fills silence quickly. It names things before they have a chance to remain ambiguous. Rick's refusal leaves silence intact. That silence is not empty. It is simply unoccupied by explanation. It allows experience to unfold at its own pace, unevenly, sometimes meaningfully, sometimes not. In that silence, moments are allowed to remain raw, uninterpreted, unclaimed. This rawness is difficult to tolerate, especially when pain is involved. Story. Lord exists because pain feels unbearable without context. People want to know what suffering is for. They want to believe it is building towards something that will justify it. Storylord offers that justification instantly. Rick does not. He does not, because he knows that justification can feel like relief while quietly rewriting reality. When pain is framed as necessary, refusing it becomes irresponsible. When loss is framed as a lesson, grief is rushed. When confusion is framed as a phase, presence is replaced by anticipation. Rick chooses presence even when it hurts. That choice does not lead to resolution. It leads to endurance. Endurance is not inspiring. It does not produce neat conclusions. It simply continues. Rick continues without guarantees, without promises that things will make sense later. He accepts that some things never do. This acceptance is not wisdom, it is tolerance. Tolerance for unfinishedness, for lives that do not arc upward, for moments that fade without payoff. Story. Lord's worldview cannot accommodate that tolerance. It needs transformation. It needs progress. It needs everything to add up. Rick allows subtraction. He allows loss without compensation. He allows stagnation without shame. He allows stories to stop mid-sentence. This does not make him gentle or hopeful. It makes him unwilling to lie to himself about the shape of reality. Storylord's world is reassuring because it feels intentional. Rick's world is unsettling because it is not. Meaning appears sometimes unevenly without warning. Other times, it never appears at all. Rick accepts both outcomes without privileging one over the other. This is why Storylord and Rick represent two incompatible comforts. Storylord comforts by explaining. Rick comforts by not pretending. One reduces anxiety by supplying answers. The other reduces dishonesty by refusing them. Neither approach eliminates suffering. They simply distribute it differently. Storylord's approach reduces immediate discomfort, but increases long-term pressure. Everything must eventually justify itself. Rick's approach increases immediate discomfort, but preserves long-term freedom. Nothing is required to justify its existence. That freedom includes the freedom to be incomplete. Incomplete lives, incomplete healing, incomplete understanding. Story. Lord cannot allow incompletion to remain unnamed. He must label it as transition. Rick leaves it as is. This is why Storylord feels more dangerous the longer you sit with him. Not because he harms directly, but because he narrows the range of acceptable experience. He decides which emotions are productive, which pains are meaningful, which paths are valid. Rick refuses that narrowing, even though it costs him comfort. In that refusal, there is no triumph, no moral victory, only continuation. Life goes on without explanation. Some things remain unresolved. Some questions never receive answers. Some stories do not finish. Storylord would call that failure. Rick calls it reality. And in choosing reality without apology, Rick keeps the door open for experiences to arrive without being immediately claimed, without being forced into shape, without being required to mean something right away. That openness is fragile. It must be protected repeatedly. Storylord's logic will always return, quietly, each time uncertainty feels unbearable. Each time silence feels like neglect. Each time meaning feels necessary for survival. Rick does not destroy that logic. He simply refuses to obey it. And in that refusal, small and uncelebrated, the story remains open. Not because it is building towards something, but because no one has closed it yet. Which for Rick is enough. What that openness ultimately protects is not chaos, but authenticity. The ability for a moment to be exactly what it is, without being shaped into something more acceptable. Story. Lord's presence smooths reality until it fits expectations. Rick's refusal leaves reality uneven, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes quiet, sometimes empty of obvious purpose. That emptiness is where many people struggle the most. An empty space invites interpretation. It invites doubt. It invites the question of whether something is wrong. Story. Lord answers that question quickly and decisively. He assures you that nothing is wrong, that this is all part of the design, that the emptiness will soon be filled with meaning. Rick does not offer that reassurance. He allows the emptiness to exist. This allowance is not hopeful. It does not promise eventual fulfillment. It simply acknowledges that not everything arrives with significance attached. Some moments pass through a life without leaving a clear mark. Some experiences do not transform you. Some pain does not teach. Rick accepts this without trying to elevate it into philosophy. Story. Lord cannot do that. His entire function is elevation. He lifts experience into narrative importance, whether it wants to be lifted or not. He cannot leave something low, ordinary, or unresolved. Everything must rise into purpose. Rick lets things stay where they land. This difference becomes most apparent in how each treats suffering. Story. Lord insists suffering must justify itself. It must lead to growth, wisdom, or redemption. Rick knows that suffering often does none of those things. It simply hurts. Treating that hurt as raw rather than instructional is, for him, a form of honesty. Honesty is not comforting. It does not soften pain. It does not explain it away. But it also does not manipulate it. Rick would rather endure pain without explanation than accept an explanation that turns pain into obligation. Story Lord's logic risks doing exactly that. When pain is framed as necessary, enduring it becomes virtuous. Ending it becomes premature. Questioning it becomes weakness. Rick rejects that moralization entirely. Pain does not need to earn its place. This rejection does not make Rick compassionate. It makes him resistant to narratives that justify harm by promising payoff. He does not believe that suffering must be redeemed to be legitimate. It is legitimate because it exists. That stance is difficult to live with. It offers no closure, no lesson, no reassurance that things will make sense later. Story. Lord offers all of those things generously. That generosity is why he is tempting. He does not force meaning. He offers it eagerly. Rick declines. Declining meaning does not remove it from the world. Meaning still appears, sometimes unexpectedly. Rick is not opposed to those moments. He simply refuses to require them. When meaning arises naturally, it is real. When it is imposed prematurely, it becomes distortion. Story Lord imposes, Rick waits. Waiting is not passive here. It is a deliberate restraint, a refusal to rush interpretation, a refusal to collapse uncertainty into narrative too quickly. Rick accepts that some questions remain unanswered forever. Story Lord cannot tolerate that possibility. This tolerance is what ultimately defines Story Lord's danger. He cannot coexist with ambiguity. He must resolve it, even if resolution flattens complexity. Rick chooses complexity, even when it hurts. That choice is not heroic. It does not feel good. It does not make life easier. It simply keeps experience honest. In the end, Story Lord is not really a villain because he does not seek to dominate or destroy. He seeks to comfort. He seeks to organize. He seeks to reassure. Those are not evil desires. They are deeply human ones. What makes him unsettling is that he does not know when to stop. Rick's resistance is not about rejecting stories altogether. It is about preserving the option to live without one when none fits. To exist without arc, to feel without explanation, to continue without closure. That option is fragile. It is easy to lose when uncertainty becomes overwhelming. Story Lord will always be waiting at that moment, offering structure in exchange for freedom. Rick keeps saying no, not loudly, not convincingly, just consistently. And in that quiet consistency, the story remains open, not progressing, not resolving, not teaching a lesson, just continuing, uneven and unresolved, exactly as Rick insists it should. And as that uneven continuation stretches on, something unexpected happens. The absence of forced meaning begins to feel less like a void and more like room. Room for responses that are not pre-written. Room for feelings that do not have to line up neatly. Room for moments that can exist briefly and then disappear without explanation. Story Lord would call that waste. Rick experiences it as space. Space is comfortable because it offers no instructions. It does not tell you how to feel or what comes next. It does not promise that endurance will be rewarded. It simply exists, waiting to be occupied or left alone. Rick's world is full of this kind of space. It is why his life feels disjointed, restless, and unresolved. It is also why it remains open. In Story Lord's world, openness is always temporary. It is a setup, a pause before the lesson. Rick's openness has no such destination. It is not going anywhere. That is what makes it frightening and paradoxically honest. Story Lord believes that people need stories to survive. Rick believes people survive first, and stories follow later if they follow at all. That distinction matters. One treats narrative as a necessity. The other treats it as a byproduct. Story Lord elevates structure above experience. Rick refuses to do that. This refusal keeps Rick from offering comfort, even when it would be easy to do so. He does not reassure others that everything happens for a reason. He does not promise that pain will lead somewhere. He does not frame suffering as meaningful by default. This makes him seem cold, but it also prevents him from lying. Story Lord lies gently. He lies in a way that feels kind. He says, "This matters. This will pay off. This is going somewhere." Often, those statements are true. Sometimes they are not. Story Lord does not distinguish between the two. He cannot. His system depends on certainty. Rick lives with the uncertainty of not knowing which moments will matter and which will simply fade. He does not enjoy that uncertainty. He tolerates it. That tolerance is his quiet resistance. Over time, this resistance shapes a different kind of relationship to life, one where significance is rare but genuine, where meaning appears unevenly and without announcement, where nothing is guaranteed to be important, and therefore when something is, it feels real rather than assigned. Story Lord's world is full of importance. Rick's world is sparse. That sparsity is not emptiness. It is selectivity. Meaning is not everywhere, but when it appears, it is not forced. It arrives on its own terms. This is why Rick does not attempt to replace Story Lord with a counter-narrative. He does not propose a better story. He proposes the absence of obligation. He allows stories to emerge if they must, but he does not require them to justify existence. That absence of obligation is what Story Lord cannot tolerate. Without obligation, there is no guarantee of coherence. Without coherence, there is anxiety. Story Lord exists to remove that anxiety by any means necessary. Rick accepts the anxiety because it preserves freedom. Freedom here does not mean happiness. It means the freedom to experience things without being told what they are for. The freedom to stop without failing. The freedom to drift without being corrected. The freedom to live without earning meaning. Story Lord's presence makes clear how radical that freedom actually is. How rare it is to allow life to remain unstructured. How tempting it is to accept explanation instead. How easy it is to trade openness for reassurance. Rick keeps the trade from happening, not once, but repeatedly, in small refusals that never feel like victories. He does not defeat Story Lord. He outlasts him by refusing to participate fully in his logic. That refusal leaves the story unfinished. And that, ultimately, is the point. An unfinished story is not broken. It is alive. It can still change, not because it must, but because it can. Story. Lord wants endings. Rick wants continuation. The universe offers both possibilities endlessly. Rick chooses the one that leaves the door open.